So good morning. My name is Eric Wishart. I'm the Vice President of the Foreign Correspondents Club and a journalist with AFP News Agency. And it's my great honor and pleasure this morning to introduce our very distinguished speaker, Professor Noam Chomsky. Before I hand the discussion over to President Jody Schneider and Professor Chomsky, I'd just like to remind you of a couple of upcoming Zoom events as part of our series of talks in the FCC. On Monday, we have Kishore Mahbubani, who's an Asia scholar and author, who'll be talking about his new book, Has China Won? And then we'll be having a panel discussion on Wednesday, Divorce, Decoupling or Conflict, Sino-American Relations and the New Cold War. I know it's a bit of a cliche to say that our speaker doesn't need any introduction, but Noam Chomsky has been a renowned thinker and intellectual for many years. He's a laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, and professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's taught for more than 50 years. He's considered the founder of modern linguistics and one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world, and he's published on US foreign policy, Mideast politics, and democratic society. He's also written more than 100 books, several of which I can say I've purchased and read, so I'm personally delighted to have Professor Chomsky as our speaker this morning. So welcome everybody. There is a function in the chat where you can ask questions. So without further ado, I'll pass the microphone to Jody Schneider, the club president and senior international editor at Bloomberg News Agency. Jody, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, evening, Professor Chomsky. You're in Arizona, correct? So we appreciate you you taking time out to talk to us. And so I'll get started right away. And please do, as Eric said, send over questions, and we will. And if you tell us who you are, we will ask Professor Chomsky your question with your name. So on July 31st, Professor Chomsky, as the U.S. passed, sadly, the very terrible milestone of 150,000 deaths from the coronavirus. Now I think we're up to about 160,000 in the U.S. You were quoted as saying that you thought decades of neoliberal policies had left the U.S. Social safety net in shambles and were at the root of the pandemic. Can you talk to us about that? What evidence you see for that, and how far back the U.S. should have been preparing? What do you think could have been done to prevent, or at least to blunt what has now been one of the worst outbreaks and worst death tolls from the pandemic?
I should start by saying that those are very appropriate questions, because the same situation is arising again right now. In 2003, as you know, the SARS epidemic was contained. Scientists warned at the time that it's very likely that another coronavirus epidemic, maybe pandemic, would be coming, told us exactly how to prepare for it, exactly as they're telling us now with regard to the next likely one. But it's not enough to know the facts. Somebody has to make use of them. Well, the drug companies are the obvious candidate, huge profits, enormous labs, but they're blocked. They're blocked simply by ordinary capitalist logic. They are profit-making institutions. They want to make profit tomorrow, not prepare for a possible catastrophe a few years down the road, which probably won't be very profitable anyway. So they're out. Well, the government could step in, has enormous laboratories, rich resources. Actually, the federal government in the United States does most of the basic research development for vaccines and drugs anyway, before hands the results over to private corporations, but they're blocked. They're blocked by neoliberalism. You recall Ronald Reagan's pronouncement when he took office 40 years ago, that government is the problem, not the solution. That translates as meaning that decisions have to be removed from government, which has the flaw that it's partly under popular influence, and handed over to private power, which is totally unaccountable to the public. And that's the foundation principle of neoliberalism. So they're blocked. That doesn't mean that nothing could be done. There were many efforts despite these impediments. So when President Obama came into office in January 2009, the first thing he did, in fact, was to call the Presidential Science and Technology Advisory Board, convene them, first mission to lay out a program to prepare for a likely pandemic. They came back a couple of weeks later, had the program, he put it into practice. There were some preparations made that lasted until January 2017, when Donald Trump took office. His first act when he took office was to dismantle all the preparations. So no preparations left. He then proceeded to terminate programs in which US scientists were working with their Chinese colleagues to try to investigate potential coronaviruses in the bat colonies deep in the caves in Wuhan province and elsewhere. They were dismantled. There were simulations run as late as October 2019 on the effects of a likely pandemic. They were ignored. The United States was singularly unprepared when the pandemic finally struck. Then it got worse. There were countries, mostly in East Asia, Oceania, which responded very quickly when China identified the virus, sequenced the genome, presented it to the World Health Organization on the world on January 10th. At that point, every virologist in the world knew exactly what was happening. Many acted, East Asia, Oceania primarily. Europe sort of dithered, finally started to react. Some fairly effectively, except for Britain, which was the outlier, much worse off than the others. The United States did nothing. Reports kept coming to the White House from US intelligence, from health officials, no interest. This went on until mid-March. By that time, the stock market was starting to decline. Trump noticed that and began to take some very confused actions. One thing one day, one the next day. I won't go through the details, but the United States is basically a wreck. It has 4% of the world's population, 25% of the cases. If you look back at late March, the United States was almost exactly comparable to Europe in number of cases and deaths. Since then, the European curve has declined very sharply. The US curve is flat, slightly increasing. It's where I live in Arizona has a governor who's a Trump loyalist. So he opened the state much too early. Arizona is now vying for the international record for the highest number of cases per capita. And similar things are happening in different places. Some places, mostly with Democratic governors, they're doing something, but there's no national plan. And Trump has been flailing around desperately to find some scapegoat to cover up for the fact that he's responsible for killing over 100,000 Americans. Can't calculate exactly. So blame China, blame the World Health Organization, blame Democrats, blame anyone. And that's the situation we're in now in the United States. There is no progress being made. It's getting worse.
What would you do now if you had the power and if you could, you know, talking about all these things that could have been done earlier in terms of prevention and way back to when the U.S., what the U.S. was supposed to have learned from SARS, what would you do now if they put you in charge of this? If President Trump called you and said, Noam Chomsky, I want you to head the task force, which I realize is unlikely to happen, but what would you do?
Well, I would do what every other country, just about every other country is doing, the exception of Brazil, one or two others. Follow the advice of American scientists. They're giving the advice that's followed to by the whole world, by the wrong scientists. So we can certainly do at least what Europe did, if not what South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand did. That much we can do. It's necessary right now to impose a lockdown, not open it prematurely, just in order to foster Trump's electoral prospects, which is what's being done. The lockdown can flatten the curve. When it moves, it's much too late to do what more advanced countries did, like South Korea, for example, where they didn't have a lockdown. They just did careful testing, tracing, and contacting. So they were able to localize the epidemic in particular places. China's doing the same with its appointed responses. It's too late for that in the United States and probably in Britain. It's necessary to have a full lockdown. The Federal Reserve has the resources to compensate for the costs. The U.S. can print its own currency virtually without limit. It still remains, there's no inflation threat remotely in sight. So that's a perfectly possible way out. And it'll just have to wait until the couple of weeks the curve will flatten as it did in Europe. Then you can begin slow, systematic openings keyed to the situation. Try to make sure that there's no major indoor events. One thing that's happening now is that churches, it's a very religious country, churches all over the place, they want to open and bring in people into the church. The lockdown should prevent that. There are churches suing the government and the states to try to prevent it. Young teenage parties have to be taken stop. That can't go on. Something has to be done about the colleges and the schools. They're in serious trouble. They can't be opened just in order to make the country look good on election day, which is Trump's only concern. So we basically know what to do. Problem is to do it. And then comes the next step. We can be very confident that another pandemic is coming if this is ever resolved. We've been lucky so far. So far, the coronaviruses have either been highly contagious and not very lethal, like this one, or highly lethal and not very contagious, like Ebola. We're not guaranteed that next time. Might be highly contagious and lethal. We might be facing something like the Black Death. We can prepare for it, but it has to be done. Capitalist logic blocks it. Neoliberal assault prevents the alternative. Those have to be dismantled. Those are not acts of God. They are human decisions that can be made differently. But we should realize what we're facing. If that isn't done, there'll be another pandemic, probably much worse than this one, intensified by the impact of global warming and habitat destruction, which is just making it worse.
Thank you. Well, we're starting to get some questions. One is on the pandemic. It is, we are approaching 3 times the number of dead as died in the Vietnam War. How can Americans be made aware of the seriousness of the pandemic? And an interesting follow-up question there. And should President Trump face murder or manslaughter charges over his handling of the pandemic? Or I guess mishandling.
Well, it's a very difficult situation. When you have a government and mass media trumpeting the same message, it's not serious, don't worry about it, it's a fake, so on. It's very hard to get people organized. So just to give you some polling results about, if you look at Republicans, which is, it's a minority party, but almost half the population, they are being told by their revered leader that it's nothing much, don't worry about it, just like the flu, it'll go away miraculously, don't worry about all these alarmists. They hear that then on Trump's echo chamber, Fox News, the Murdoch cable station, which is about the only source of information for Republicans. Fox News just reiterates what Trump says. Then comes more. So there are, all around the world, there are crazy conspiracy theories circulating. I'm sure you've seen them. One of them is that the coronavirus was started by Bill Gates, George Soros, in order to control the world's population. About 70% of the American population has seen that. Of Republicans, about half those who've seen it, over half, 2/3 of those who've seen it, believe it. I mean, that's what we're, there are other media, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post. Half of Republicans call them the enemy of the people, following their master. About half of Republicans think that the government, meaning Trump, should have the authority to close down media if they carry out bad behavior, like producing fake news, which is what they're told. It's a serious problem to deal with, not just on this issue. I'll take a much more serious issue, which we can't delay, global warming. That's not going to go away. This will be overcome, that won't. About 20% of Republicans think that it's a serious problem in which humans have some role. 20%. They hear all the time it's just a left-wing conspiracy. Well, that makes things difficult. Requires major cultural changes, and it's being severely harmed by the most dangerous political figure in human history, and that is not an exaggeration. Hitler wanted to kill all the Jews, 30 million Slavs. He wasn't trying to destroy organized human life on Earth, which is what Trump is racing towards. That's his climate policy. Let's maximize the use of fossil fuels, including the most dangerous of them. Let's eliminate all the regulations that mitigate the consequences and that save Americans by restricting pollution. Under the cover of the pandemic, these are being quietly eliminated one after the other. The investor class understands this. They're very concerned that Trump is declining in the polls. You can read headlines in the major press. So take the fossil fuel industry is localized primarily in Texas. The Texas press, Houston Chronicle, has headlines telling us that fossil fuel companies are extremely concerned that Trump is declining in the polls. They're writing massive checks to the Republicans to ensure that somehow they can save him. They want to maximize the use of fossil fuels out of good capitalist logic. That's how you make money tomorrow. The fate of the world is not their business. None of this is a law of nature, but that's the way capitalist societies work.
I want to ask one more question on related to this, and then to move on to some other things. I do want to get to some press issues later, so I'm glad that you started bringing it up. But this is from Eric, who is our resident fake news expert. As a linguist and cognitive scientist, what is your analysis of why people turn to these fake cures and conspiracy theories, which, as you've noted, President Trump seems to sometimes have a fondness for? Why are they turning to these to find a way through the crisis? And what do you think about the drumbeat of misinformation from the White House on down about the pandemic?
Well, that's part of the answer to your question. People are angry, frightened, desperate. This is actually pre-Trump. 40 years of neoliberalism have left the victims of this assault angry, resentful, isolated, contemptuous of government. It's in Europe, it's in the United States, see it everywhere. That's fertile territory for demagogues who can say, I can save you, follow me. It's also fertile territory for conspiracy theories. Now, people want some understanding of what's happening, but they're not getting it from the media. They're not getting it from the intellectual classes, certainly not getting it from the government. So they search around for something that'll explain it. Why is this happening to us? That's the kind of situation in which you do get conspiracy theories. This has happened with every major plague in history. Let's kill the Jews. Let's do something. Somebody's responsible. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is this happening to me? So that's pretty natural. It's one of the reasons why people turn to extremist religions. So maybe 2/3 of the population in the United States is expecting the second coming of Jesus, maybe in their lifetimes. Okay, maybe that'll save us. When you're living in an intellectual environment in which there are no answers, no coherent answers available, you're suffering, you don't see why, you grasp onto something. Incidentally, this is not just true in the United States. Let me give you a striking personal example. When one of the things that happens on the internet, I'm surprised it doesn't happen more than it does, is people put up fake postings attributed to somebody. Happens to me pretty often. There was, when the pandemic started, somebody circulated a statement on the internet attributed to me, describing in detail how the coronavirus was started in a US government biological laboratory and then released in order to take over the whole world. Once something's on the internet, you can't do anything about it. You can deny it, you can say what you like, but it's there. I started getting letters from all over the world, including Europe, including friends and colleagues, educated people, saying, thank you for finally telling the truth. I mean, this is all over. The United States is a particularly extreme example, but it's happening all over, and I think you can trace a good deal of it to the effect of neoliberalism. It had a goal, remember. The goal of neoliberalism was to transfer decisions, authority, away from the public to the hands of private power and to atomize the population. You recall Margaret Thatcher, there's no society, just individuals tossed out in the market to somehow survive for themselves. And she surely didn't know it, but she was paraphrasing Karl Marx. He condemned the autocratic rulers of his day for trying to turn the public into what he called a sack of potatoes, just isolated people who can't get together, can't resist, are subject to authority. In this case, it's the authority of concentrated private power. The first acts first acts that both Thatcher and Reagan carried out was to demolish labor unions. First move, both cases. Reagan went as far as authorizing scabs, strikebreakers, illegal in every country except at the time South Africa. Did it right away. The labor unions have been smashed in both countries. Why? Well, that's one of the very few ways in which people can organize to protect themselves. So we got to get rid of them. Eliminate public schools, but do it by underfunding. Don't give them enough funding so they don't work. Then support private schools as an alternative. All throughout the society, eliminate the means for people to organize, act collectively, make decisions, transfer it into the hands of private power. And the results are predictable and perfectly plain. So you take a look at the United States. Right now, 0.1% of the population, not 1%, 0.1% have 20% of the wealth. That's twice as much as when Reagan took over. The majority of the population get by from week to week with nothing left over from one paycheck to the next until, if anything goes wrong, you're in trouble. There's no universal health system, unlike other countries. That would be people getting together, can't do that. No associations, can't protect yourself with unions, they're gone. So you're alone. So you get angry and resentful. It's not that the Democrats do that much better. A lot of this is the responsibility of Clinton, picked up and pushed most of the destructive policies. When Obama came in, there was a lot of hope among working people, poor people, that something would happen. Had nice rhetoric about hope and change. Take a look at what happened. As he came in, immediately there was a crash of the housing market, huge housing bubble because of predatory actions of financial institutions let loose by the Clinton administration and deregulation, crashed. Everybody's wealth was lost, led to a financial crisis. Congress passed legislation. Had two parts. One part was to bail out the perpetrators of the crisis, the banks, investment firms who had made the predatory loans. We have to bail them out. The other part of the legislation was to help the people who were victims, the people who had lost their homes, who'd been foreclosed. Let's help them. You can guess which part of the legislation was enacted. Okay, that left people pretty angry. By 2010, 2 years in office, Obama, they were already voting Republican. Even in Massachusetts, the most liberal state, people were furious. Okay, that's, if this goes on, well, okay, it goes way back, a lot of history I'm omitting, but the recent history is this. It's had very dire effects.
I'd like to kind of move on to some global politics. We've been discussing the U.S. Largely here. We are obviously sitting here in Hong Kong in the center of this potential, some would say emerging, Cold War between the U.S. and China on a number of fronts. As a political activist and dissident and media watcher and critic, how worried are you about this? How worried are you that this could is more than the saber rattling and propaganda, I would presume you would call it, on both sides, and could it be something more? And I'm also going to throw in there that we had a very sad anniversary in the past day. Actually, it's still August 6th where you are, the 75th anniversary of the A-bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and a few days later on Nagasaki. And, you know, that's chilling. So talk to us about your what you're thinking about the U.S. and China and how worried both countries, citizens of both countries should be about what could happen. And have we had any lessons in the past 75 years? Have we learned anything from the tragic events of August 1945?
Well, I'm old enough to remember August 6th very well, unforgettable memory. And we've been living under that shadow ever since. As I'm sure you know, every year the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists convenes a gathering of scientists, political analysts, assess the world situation and try to capture it by setting what's called the Doomsday Clock. How far is the minute hand from midnight? Midnight means termination. And when it was set first in 1947, it was 7 minutes to midnight. Oscillated up and back since. The worst was 1953, when the United States and the Soviet Union exploded thermonuclear weapons. That told the world that human ingenuity has now reached the point where it can wipe out everything. Great success. The minute hand moved 2 minutes to midnight. Moved around since. Didn't return to 2 minutes to midnight until 2 years ago. Every year that Trump has been in office, it's moved closer to midnight. 2 years ago, it moved to 2 minutes to midnight. This past January, the analysts abandoned minutes. They turned to seconds. It's now 100 seconds to midnight. It's January, before the pandemic was well known. They gave 3 reasons. One is the growing threat of nuclear war, which is increasing. Trump is dismantling the arms control regime, which gave some limited protection. By now, there's virtually nothing of it left. It's refusing to renew the New START treaty, which is the last remnant. That's one. The other is the failure to deal effectively with the threat of environmental catastrophe. Again, much of the world is doing something, sometimes a lot. The United States is almost the only country that's racing in the opposite direction under Trump, not under Obama, under Trump, the disaster. One of the reasons why the Texas press is now reporting that investors are pouring money into the Trump campaign is that Biden, under a lot of popular pressure, has moved towards the most effective climate policy of practically anyone. It's not enough, but it's very good. And they hate it, so they want Trump to get back in because he's racing towards maximizing destruction by fossil fuels. Now, that's the second. The third was deterioration of democracy. Now, it sounds at first as if that doesn't belong, but if you think for a moment, it does, because a vibrant democracy of informed, engaged public is the only way to deal with these major crises, which takes us back to Hong Kong, where democracy is being undermined by the regional power, China. China is trying to reassert its traditional role as the dominant force in Asia. It's not an imperial power in the Western sense. It didn't invade and conquer countries, but it insisted on they're paying tribute to China. You know the story better than I do. Don't have to run through it. Trying to reestablish that position. The United States won't tolerate it. The world, whatever you may learn in your course in international relations theory, the fact is that the world is run like the mafia, very similar to the mafia. The mafia Don, the godfather, does not tolerate any interference. It doesn't tolerate states that might challenge it. It doesn't even challenge small states that get out of line. If you're the godfather and some small storekeeper doesn't pay protection money, you don't need the money, but you don't let it go. You send in your goons to smash them up and destroy the store. That's international affairs. If some small country carries out what in official terminology is called successful defiance, that's government internal documents referring to Cuba in this case. If a country carries out successful defiance, it has to be stopped. That's like the small storekeeper. That's why the U.S. invaded Indochina, invaded Grenada, case after case. It's not a new invention. The American Revolution was treated the same way. And the great statesmen of Europe were terrified about the spread of what was called Republican ideology, not today's sense of republic, just democratic ideology that could undermine the British Empire, could undermine authority, civilization. You have to stop it. That's the way the world works. Okay, right now, China's a rising power. It's nowhere near the United States, way behind. I mean, if you take any dimension you like, in the military dimension, it's not even worth talking. The United States has higher military expenses than about the 10 lower powers put together, and technologically far more advanced. And Russia's way more advanced than China. But it is increasing. Far behind, but increasing. There's economic growth, but it remains a very poor country. You take a look at the Human Development Index of the United Nations, it's ranked around 90th or so, has serious internal problems that the richer countries don't have. If you look at world wealth, there's a really outstanding political economist in Hong Kong, one of the best in the world. Sean Starr is his name, teaches in Hong Kong. He's done the major work on a very important topic. He has a book coming out on it right now. He's the first person to look carefully at a different measure of national wealth. Economists usually measure national wealth by gross domestic product, which is something, but it's not a very good measure. Starrs has looked at something else, I think for the first time. How much of the world's wealth is in the hands of nationally based multinational corporations? Okay. So how much of the world's wealth is held by US-based multinationals? The figure is stunning. It's about 50%. And just about every category, retail, manufacturing, finance, US corporations are first or sometimes second. China's way behind. If you look at, China has grown economically, but most of the wealth that's produced doesn't go to China. So if you take Apple, Apple phones, for example, China assembles them, but most of the profit goes to Foxconn, other Taiwanese conglomerates that control it. And most of the profit, the great bulk, goes back to Apple. That's where the profits go. And Apple makes sure that it doesn't have to pay taxes by setting up an office in Ireland, probably about the size of this room. Maybe a secretary comes in every once in a while. So it's based in Ireland. Now that was facilitated by Reagan. Prior to Reagan, that was illegal. But Reagan opened the doors. We have to have free market. So it doesn't have to pay taxes, makes most of the profit. These days, major corporations like Apple find it more profitable to devote resources to financial manipulations than to research and development. That was not true under Steve Jobs. Then they worked on research and development. Now that's declined under Tom Cook, and they act like most capitalist corporations moving into financial markets, which if they have an effect on the economy, it's probably negative. But these are the developments of the neoliberal system. Well, going back to to the Cold War between China and the United States, that's a disaster for the world. This is a moment more than ever where we have to have international cooperation. The crises that we face are all international. All the ones that we've mentioned. Pandemic is obviously international. It's if a vaccine is developed, it should be a public good, like the Salk vaccine for polio 70 years ago, just given to the public, no patents. That's what should be done by a vaccine today. Actually, China's the one country that's called for that. They claim, I don't know if they're really going to do it, but they at least claim that if a Chinese scientist develop a vaccine, they'll offer it free to the public. Okay, that's the right stance to take. The West is taking the opposite. Each country is trying to maximize, to even monopolize, if possible, the products that can be used for the remedying the crisis. The United States tried to take up there's one drug, remdesivir, which seems to be a palliative. They're trying to collect all of it. And they're all trying to make sure that they control the patents. And they're in the hands of private corporations, which can gouge, they can charge whatever they like because of the rules of the World Trade Organization, which is called free trade, but it's a joke. Highly protectionist, what are called intellectual property rights are exorbitant patents have never existed in history. If they had existed, the United States would never have developed, or other countries. But it's a way to, what economists call kicking away the ladder, that we borrow technology from other countries and we block it. The exorbitant patent rights permit the drugs, mostly monopolized by now under the market conditions, that allows them to charge ridiculous prices, way beyond what the drug or vaccine requires. None of this is necessary. Again, this mostly goes back to Reagan and the neoliberal years. Pandemic is an international problem. Countries should be cooperating in dealing with it. Same is true of global warming. The polar ice caps are going to keep melting, no matter who's at war with each other, and with all the effects that has. Nuclear war is the same. All the countries with nuclear weapons have to radically contain them or get rid of them. It's not just Russia and the United States. It's the worst case. They have way too many. India and Pakistan could go to war over a water crisis as the Himalayan glaciers melt. Israel has huge store of nuclear weapons, threatened to use and might again. These things could break out anywhere. The nuclear issue is an international issue. The global warming is an international issue. Pandemic obviously is. There has to be cooperation on these things. Allowing conflict to develop is, first of all, unnecessary, and secondly, catastrophic. Now, right now, the United States there are confrontations between China and the United States, but they're not off the coast of California. They're not in the Caribbean, and they're off the coast of China. China's doing things it shouldn't be doing there. It's doing there what the United States does over most of the world. It shouldn't be doing it. But that confrontation has to be dealt with by negotiation and diplomacy. There's no way to do it by force unless we want to all destroy ourselves. And the same is true of other confrontations. There's a lot the United States is quite open, publicly, in fact, publicly trying to prevent China from developing. That's not only cruel, but senseless. If China develops, it's to everybody's benefit. If China manages to develop the best solar panels in the world, we all benefit. If China happens to develop a vaccine, we all benefit. And reciprocally, that's the way things ought to work. Now they can, but not if leaders are pursuing their own interests of power, prestige, and insisting on creating crises where they don't have to exist.
I wanted to ask about Hong Kong. We have several good questions on that. I'm going to combine them. One is from Florence de Changer, who's our former president of the club, who's asking, what do you think of the open support that the US has brought to the Hong Kong protesters, and how has that influenced what's been happening here? Also from Angel Kwan with Apple Daily, one of the bigger news organizations here in Hong Kong. How will Hong Kong likely be affected under the increasing tension between the US and China? And after the new national security law has been imposed, how do you foresee the future of Hong Kong? Obviously, this is of major interest to all of us sitting here, including those of us in the Foreign Correspondents Club who are covering this.
Well, it's always worth remembering the old saying that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. Hong Kong's the grass. If the elephants start fighting, Hong Kong's lost. Hong Kong, Taiwan, other countries in the Chinese periphery, Vietnam, have much to lose if the confrontation continues. It's in their enormous interest to see it resolved by diplomacy, negotiations, sane policies. There's the pressure on Hong Kong to undermine its democratic procedures and practices and opportunities is wrong, nefarious. Anything that's possible should be done to prevent it, but force isn't going to prevent it. The only thing that will ease these measures is a reduction in international tensions, which is the one factor that can bring China to reduce its repression. It's not only China and Hong Kong. I'll take a much older one. Take, say, the United States and Cuba. Cuba gained its independence in December 1959, 60 years ago. Within months, the United States planes were bombing Cuba from U.S. territory. A couple of months later, there was a formal decision in the government to overthrow the government of Cuba. That was Eisenhower. Kennedy came in, invaded, invasion failed, then launched a major terror campaign, very substantial terror campaign, to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That's the way it was described internally, to try to force Cuba to overthrow its government. That went on, that's what helped bring on the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Part of the reason was to protect against that. Almost destroyed the world. Terror continued. There's been an economic strangulation. There's a small, poor country off the coasts of the major superpower. Economic strangulation, extremely severe. When the United States imposes economic warfare, it's third-party warfare. It's against everybody else, too. Nobody's allowed to violate U.S. sanctions. If they do, they get thrown out of the international financial system. Go back to the mafia. So Europe doesn't like the sanctions, but they observe them. They have to. In fact, we know the world opinion on this comes up in the United Nations every year, General Assembly. Security Council, US just vetoes everything. Comes up in the General Assembly. The vote is unanimous, literally, against the US embargo. One exception, Israel votes with the United States because it has to. It's a client. But it barely even gets reported in the United States. It doesn't matter. We do what we like. And the official reason I started quoting it, goes back to the Kennedy years, is internal documents declassified. Cuba's successful defiance of US policies that go back 150 years. That means to the Monroe Doctrine. 1823, in which President Monroe declared the U.S. policy of basically ruling the Western Hemisphere. Couldn't implement it at that time. Britain was too powerful. But over the years, it was basically implemented. Cuba's defying it. Can't have that. Have to destroy them. I can mention much else in the world. But these are the kinds of things. Cuba, Hong Kong, not being oppressed to that extent, but it's bad enough. But these things have to stop. They can be done. In the case of a powerful state like the United States, the world can't do a thing. Has to come from within. And can't come from within unless people at least know about it. And what I've just said, probably you find 1 in 1,000 Americans has ever heard of it. It's, all we know is Cuba is somehow bad. Can't be like Cuba. But it has to come from within. And for countries like Hong Kong, it's going to have to come from reduction of international tensions, which can bring about relaxation on the part of Chinese efforts to establish their Asian hegemony. If there's another way, I've never heard of it.
Do you see any signs of optimism? Anything where you go, okay, this is going in the right direction? I know this is different than the Doomsday Clock, but
all over the place. Now, the Hong Kong protests, for example, were a major sign of optimism. I mean, you know, they didn't totally succeed, but they laid the seeds for future progress. Take the United States right now. The biggest social movement in American history developed quickly, suddenly, right after the murder of George Floyd. An enormous popular movement all over. It has overwhelming popular support. About 2/3 of the public supports it. Nothing like that for social movements ever. Not way beyond what Martin Luther King achieved at the peak of the civil rights movement. And it's a very serious movement. A lot of solidarity, black-white solidarity. Trump is trying to crush it. He sent troops to Portland. I read about that. Notice, not federal troops. He didn't send the army. And there's a reason for that. The army probably would have disobeyed. When he tried to use the army in Washington to disperse protesters, the military command withdrew them. He doesn't have total control over the army. So what he sent was basically paramilitaries. The groups that he sent were tactical units. It's a group called BORTAC. I know it very well because it operates a few miles from where I live. I live in Arizona, not that far north from the border. And the border, very harsh desert. Refugees are fleeing in misery from the destruction of their countries by the United States, mainly Reagan, but also following. The Border Patrol, BORTAC is its tactical unit, are free to do anything they want. They're unsupervised. Their orders are to attack and disperse the refugees. Somebody leaves a bottle of water for them, smash it up so they don't get it. A couple of days after Portland, it probably wasn't reported in Hong Kong, but after Trump was compelled to withdraw the paramilitaries from Portland, the paramilitaries in Portland had to face, first of all, white people, and then women. The Portland moms, they were called, the women who lined up and said, we don't want you to invade our city. That's not good publicity, sending paramilitaries to attack middle-class women. So they withdrew the paras from there. But they continued to work south of the border. 2 days later, 2 days after they were withdrawn from Portland, right south of where I live, they attacked a humanitarian aid center. It was set up in the desert to provide medical aid, bottles of water to refugees who were able to straggle in if they were able to survive the desert, 100-degree Fahrenheit degrees heat, very harsh desert. So they entered that with a big show of force armored vehicles, come in and tie up the hands of all the medical workers and disperse the refugees, or take them into custody, and take them out of the beds. And that's war tech. Okay. You couldn't do that in Portland, but they can do it here. Well, these things can be stopped. Like in the town where I live, Tucson, Arizona, it's a pretty conservative town, conservative state. The humanitarian aid workers have tremendous support. You see on signs on all the lawns, a lot of lawns, saying humanitarian aid is not a crime. When they've been brought up for federal charges for crimes like leaving bottles of water in the desert or helping a refugee who makes his way to your cabin, felony, be in jail for 20 years. When they come up for crimes, they're released by juries. Juries won't convict them, local people. So if you want to ask about optimism, yes, plenty of signs of it all over.
And we have time for just a quick question. And so I'm going to ask what you're reading. What should we give us a couple book recommendations? We had the Penn America CEO on the other day, and she gave us some good ones. So what should we be reading? We have a little bit more time on our hands these days.
Well, I'm asked that all the time, and I can never answer. Too many options, too many dimensions.
Give us a couple.
Individual interests and concerns. I have huge piles of books all around me. I don't know, probably can't see them.
No, we can.
That's the urgent reading. You're not seeing the less urgent. So I don't know. Depends what you're interested in.
Well, name one of your books that you would recommend. You've have written more than 100 or 100 or so. So name us a book that particularly us in the media would be interested in for our list this summer.
In the media, I have a couple of books specifically on the media. One is called Manufacturing Consent. It's written with a late friend, Edward Herman, died a couple of years ago. There's another one called Necessary Illusions, which is a kind of a follow-up to it. Now, there's some small, more readable pamphlets, like, I forget the names of them, a couple of them are around. But they're a couple of years old, but it's pretty much the same story. About the media now, it's very scary. I mean, when half of Republicans think that the government should have the right to close down media if it doesn't like them, that's dangerous.
Well, thank you. I wanted to thank Professor Chomsky for this wide-ranging talk. It will be soon it will be on our website at fcchk.org and posted on YouTube. I also wanted to thank everybody who sent in questions. We had a lot of them, and sorry we couldn't get to them all, but maybe we can invite Professor Chomsky to join us again, and we'll get to some of those other questions. So thank you very much. Stay safe, and again, thank you all, and thank you all for attending our Zoom event.
Bye-bye. It's my pleasure. I'll say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.